So your palms are sweating.
Oh yeah, we've all been there.
Right. Your heart is just racing. You've studied the material for over 2 years. You've read the books. You've done all the prep work. And yet the second someone actually looks at you and asks this question,
Blank.
completely blank, your mind just goes totally empty.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a deeply frustrating phenomenon, where all those hours of isolated preparation just seem to completely evaporate the second the spotlight hits you in the real world.
It really is this universal and just physically overwhelming experience because the knowledge is trapped in your head, right?
Yeah.
But the bridge to actually vocalize it just sort of collapses under pressure.
Exactly. So today we are doing a deep dive into this really inspiring case study from the Easy English podcast. It's titled The Courage to Speak, Michael's Journey to Fluency.
It's a great story.
It really is. And our mission for this deep dive is to extract the exact step-by-step framework that Michael used to overcome that paralyzing fear of real-world application. We want to show you how to transition from that, endless, comfortable cycle of preparation into actual confident performance.
Right, because we're looking at this not just as a story about language, but really as a masterclass in crossing what we can call the cognitive gaps of learning.
A cognitive gap.
Yeah, the gap between knowing something passively and executing it actively.
Yeah.
Because that gap is massive. And Michael's story gives us a blueprint for crossing it by addressing the psychology of fear, the mechanics of memory, and the physical reality of acquiring a new skill.
Okay, let's unpack this because Michael's initial situation serves as the absolute perfect baseline. So we are introduced to a learner who has been rigorously studying English for almost 2 years. And I mean rigorous in the traditional sense, right?
Very traditional.
He's reviewing vocabulary lists every single morning. Every evening, he sits down to study grammar rules. He's listening to English podcasts almost daily.
Wow.
Yeah, so his passive knowledge, his ability to consume information is huge. He understands movies, he follows complex video essays, he comprehends the vocabulary when he reads it.
So on paper, or maybe in a standardized testing environment, he's the model student. He has acquired all the data.
But then, and this is where it falls apart, someone actually speaks to him in real life.
Right.
A spontaneous interaction occurs, and the physical panic just sets in. The source text describes it so vividly. It's that sudden spike in heart rate, the sweaty palms, and this crazy sudden inability to recall simple, basic words that he fundamentally knows.
Yeah, that biological response is so real.
I actually want to look at the biology of this for a second because it isn't just a metaphor. When he feels that social pressure, he is experiencing an amygdala hijack. His brain is perceiving the pressure of a social evaluation as a literal physical threat.
Right. And that physiological response is crucial to understand. The moment the amygdala perceives that threat of judgment or failure, it just floods the system with cortisol.
Stress hormone.
Exactly. And that stress hormone effectively acts as a roadblock to the prefrontal cortex, which is where your working memory and complex thought generation live. So the physical stress response literally blocks cognitive access to the information he spent 2 years memorizing.
Which leads to that agonizing post-conversation loop.
Oh, the worst.
You know the one. He walks away from the interaction, the cortisol finally subsides, the prefrontal cortex comes back online, and suddenly he thinks, oh man, I should have said that differently. I knew that word. Why couldn't I remember it?
Because the effort is clearly there. The raw data is stored in his brain, but he just has no functional retrieval mechanism under pressure.
It reminds me of someone who spends 2 years reading these thick, complicated manuals on how to swim.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right. Like they memorized the complex physics of hydrodynamics, they studied diagrams of different stroke techniques, they understand water resistance perfectly, but they absolutely refuse to actually jump into a pool until they are certain, like 100% certain, that they won't make a splash.
Yeah, they have mistaken the study of the activity for the activity itself. They're optimizing for a theoretical environment rather than a practical one.
Exactly. And Michael eventually has an epiphany about this exact trap. He's watching this online video, and the instructor delivers a deceptively simple quote. He says, "You don't learn to speak English by studying English. You learn to speak English by speaking English."
Wow.
Yeah. Michael literally pauses the video to let that sink in. He realizes he has been using the pursuit of perfection as a shield.
What's fascinating here is the psychological trap of that waiting game. Well, waiting for a state of quote-unquote perfection is incredibly common, and it operates as a highly effective defense mechanism. Because studying feels safe.
Mhm.
Sitting alone in a room with a textbook gives you the illusion of progress while keeping you in complete control.
Because no one is watching you.
Exactly. You aren't making mistakes in front of another human being. Execution, on the other hand, is inherently vulnerable. It exposes your current limitations. So learners frequently substitute studying for doing. They use the rationale of, I'm just trying to get my grammar perfect before I try, as a convenient, socially acceptable excuse for inaction.
A socially acceptable excuse. Wow. We can call that the courage gap.
The courage gap, yeah.
And the way Michael crosses this gap is step 1 of his new framework. He realizes he has to start speaking, but he needs to bypass that amygdala hijack we talked about. So he engineers an environment with the lowest possible stakes. The very next morning, he sits alone in his room after breakfast, looks around, and simply starts speaking out loud to the empty space. Just things like, "Good morning, my name's Michael. Today I will go to work. The weather looks nice."
It sounds so simple, but by removing the audience, he removes the social threat. He completely lowers the affective filter, which is that emotional barrier that prevents learning and performance.
Right. And he does this for 10 minutes. He narrates his breakfast, his plans for the day, his hobbies. The text actually notes that his own voice sounds strange and uncomfortable to him at first.
How about that?
But when he finishes the 10 minutes, he has a profound realization. It wasn't perfect. He definitely made grammatical errors, but he actually produced the language. He generated speech.
That's a huge hurdle to clear.
Huge. From there, he escalates to step 2, tackling what we might call the retrieval gap. He takes a book called Short Stories in English for Beginners, but he abandons passive reading. Instead, after reading a single story, he closes the book, completely removing the visual safety net, and forces himself to verbally summarize the plot out loud.
Okay, taking away the visual cue is a massive escalation in cognitive difficulty.
It is, and the source material is very honest about how hard this is for him. He struggles immensely. He forgets vocabulary words he just read 30 seconds prior.
Oh, sure.
He pauses for several seconds at a time, just staring at the wall, fighting to construct a single sentence. But wait, I have to push back on this method for a second.
Okay, what's the concern?
Well, if you are sitting completely alone in your bedroom, struggling to string words together, pausing awkwardly, and undeniably making grammatical errors with no native speaker there to correct you, are you actively reinforcing bad habits? Like, isn't this kind of isolated, uncorrected practice potentially dangerous for long-term skill acquisition?
I hear that all the time. That is the most common hesitation learners have with solo practice, but it fundamentally misinterprets how the brain acquires and stabilizes a new skill. Yeah, there is a vast neurobiological difference between passive recognition, seeing a word and knowing what it means, and active recall. When Michael closes that book and struggles to summarize the story, the value of the exercise has absolutely nothing to do with grammatical perfection.
So what is the value?
The value is in the struggle itself. He is forcing his brain to retrieve information under the internal pressure of needing to generate the next word.
You're saying the struggle is the actual mechanism of learning?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Every time he forces his brain to search for a word without looking it up, he is triggering a process called myelination along his neural pathways. He's basically thickening the insulation around the neurons that connect his thought to his vocal cords.
Oh, wow.
So the goal of this solo practice isn't to be accurate, it is to build the physical habit of speech generation. You can always refine and clean up grammar later, but you cannot correct the grammar of someone who is too paralyzed to speak.
That is such a good point.
Right? By stumbling through these summaries alone, he's proving to his nervous system that it is safe to try, fail, and keep going without any catastrophic consequences.
Okay, that completely reframes the entire concept of a mistake. But here's the ceiling Michael hits with talking to an empty room, right? It builds courage, and it builds retrieval pathways, but it doesn't build new vocabulary.
True.
You can only talk to your bedroom walls about your breakfast for so long before you literally run out of things to say.
Yeah, the inputs have to match the outputs eventually.
Exactly. To grow, he had to change how he consumed new information, bridging the gap between abstract data and usable language. He was using a textbook called English Vocabulary in Use, but he decides to completely abandon the traditional method of memorizing rote lists of translated words.
Which is smart because rote memorization relies on the brain's working memory, which is notoriously inefficient for long-term retention of disconnected facts.
Right, so he intuitively shifts to a much deeper cognitive strategy. He starts creating deeply personal examples for every single new word he encounters.
Oh, I love this.
It's brilliant. If the vocabulary word is achievement, He doesn't just read the definition, he constructs a sentence directly related to his life and says it out loud. He says, "Learning English is one of my biggest achievements."
Hmm.
If the word is challenge, he says, "Speaking English is a challenge, but I enjoy it." He anchors the abstract vocabulary to his personal reality.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of cognitive science, he is leveraging a concept known as emotional tagging.
Emotional tagging.
Yeah. When you encounter isolated information, like a random vocabulary word, a statistical fact, maybe a programming command, your brain categorizes it as low priority. It has no survival or personal value.
Right, it's just noise.
Exactly. But when you tie that new information to your personal identity, your daily routine, or your emotional state, the hippocampus and the amygdala work together to tag that information with emotional salience. The brain essentially flags the data, signaling that this information is highly relevant to the individual's life and prioritizes moving it into long-term storage.
And he actually pairs this emotional tagging with a total overhaul of his listening habits, too.
Okay.
He discovers an audio program called Effortless English and begins a routine of really aggressive immersion listening. He puts the audio on everywhere.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. He listens while walking, while cleaning his apartment, during his daily commute. And because the vocabulary is now emotionally tagged and he's constantly immersed in the sounds, a major shift occurs. The English language starts to feel familiar. Expressions begin popping into his head automatically, and he crosses a massive milestone.
Let me guess, he stops translating.
Yes. He begins thinking in English rather than thinking in his native language and translating in his head.
It is huge. He's dismantling the translation barrier. He's no longer using his native language as a mediator.
It is remarkably similar to upgrading the operating system on a smartphone.
How do you mean?
Well, before this immersion, his brain was functioning like an older, clunky device. Every time he wanted to formulate a thought, he had to manually open up a mental translation app, type in the concept in his native tongue, wait for the English output, and then try to actually say it.
Which is exhausting.
He trains your cognitive battery power, it lags in real time, and it frequently crashes. But through this constant, personalized immersion, the new language ceases to be an external app. It becomes integrated into the core operating system. The processing just starts running automatically in the background.
Yeah, the reduction in cognitive load is staggering when you move from manual translation to intuitive generation.
Absolutely. But knowing the words and thinking in the language still doesn't solve the physical mechanics of speaking at a natural pace.
Like the physical side.
Which brings us to what we can call the processing gap, and the real breakthrough technique Michael discovers a few weeks later. It's a method called shadowing.
Shadowing is arguably the most potent tool in his entire framework, though it is often very misunderstood.
So the mechanics of it are straightforward but incredibly demanding. You listen to a short piece of native audio like a podcast, and you immediately repeat what the speaker is saying, word for word, sentence for sentence, in real time. You are speaking over the audio maybe just a fraction of a second behind the speaker. And the text emphasizes how impossible this felt for Michael on day one. The speaker was talking entirely too fast, Michael's own pronunciation felt awkward and clumsy, and he was missing whole chunks of sentences.
So frustrating at first.
But he pushes through. He starts with just 10 minutes a day, eventually scaling his endurance to 15 and then 20 minutes. Gradually, his rhythm locks in. But I have to play devil's advocate here because from the outside, this looks highly counterproductive.
How so?
Well, isn't shadowing just turning you into a highly trained parrot? Like if the ultimate goal is to have a spontaneous, dynamic conversation where you are responding to unpredictable human variables, how does mindlessly mimicking a pre-recorded podcast host actually translate into formulating your own original thoughts?
It seems disconnected, I'll give you that. But that critique conflates two completely different areas of the brain. Shadowing is not about thought generation, and it isn't trying to be. It is entirely about the motor cortex and the physical muscle memory of language.
Wait, so you are saying language is a physical, athletic act, not just an intellectual one?
Fundamentally, yes. Speaking requires your jaw, your tongue, your vocal cords, and your diaphragm to coordinate highly specific micro-movements at lightning speed.
Right.
And these movement patterns are completely different from the muscle memory you developed for your native language. Shadowing artificially removes the heavy cognitive burden of figuring out what to say. The podcast host is providing the vocabulary and the grammar. Because your brain no longer has to search for words, it can allocate 100% of its processing power to how to physically articulate those sounds.
Oh, that makes sense. You isolate the variables. You separate the physical act of speaking from the intellectual act of thinking.
Exactly. You are training the articulatory loop. By practicing the physical act of speaking at native speed without the stress of generating the content, you automate the physical delivery. You teach your mouth the rhythm, the intonation, and the connected speech patterns.
So it becomes muscle memory.
Yes. Eventually, that muscle memory becomes automatic. So when you do enter a real conversation later, you have freed up massive amounts of mental bandwidth because you are no longer fighting your own tongue. Your mouth already knows how to navigate the sounds, leaving your intellect free to focus purely on the spontaneity of the conversation.
Wow. And while Michael is training his articulatory loop, he is also feeding his mindset. He reads Atomic Habits by James Clear, and this provides the philosophical glue for his entire routine.
Great book.
It is. He realizes his day-to-day progress is nearly invisible. If you measure yesterday against today, nothing seems to have changed. But over a span of months, the compound interest of shadowing, solo speaking, and emotional tagging is massive.
Compound interest is the perfect way to describe it.
And most importantly, this book finalizes his perspective shift on errors. He completely stops viewing mistakes as personal failures. He starts viewing them as neutral, vital data points indicators of exactly what he needs to adjust in the next session.
And that paradigm shift is the foundation of resilience. If mistakes are perceived as failures, the amygdala fires, cortisol releases, and you just avoid the activity.
You freeze up again.
Right. But if mistakes are perceived as vital signs of learning, you actively seek out the friction of execution to gather more data.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the climax of his journey. Here's where it gets really interesting. Michael decides he has accumulated enough solo hours. He has done the prep work, he has built the courage muscle, he has automated the physical delivery. It is time to enter the arena.
The final test.
Yes. He sees an advertisement for an online English conversation club, a live, uncontrolled environment with zero safety nets, and he signs up. The source notes that as the start time approaches, the fear returns. He almost closes his laptop.
Of course he does.
But he leans on the neural pathways he built talking to an empty room. He logs in, and suddenly he is face-to-face with a grid of strangers from all over the globe. Brazil, Japan, Spain, Turkey, Germany.
He is confronting the unpredictability of human interaction, but notice the environment he chose. He chose a club of other learners, people who are navigating the exact same vulnerabilities.
Yes. The moderator asks everyone to introduce themselves. Michael's heart is racing. The spotlight is on him. It is the exact scenario that paralyzed him 2 years ago. He takes a deep breath, and the words just materialize. Hello, everyone. My name is Michael.
Wow.
It's not an analogy to compare this to a jazz musician transitioning from practicing alone in basement to joining a live improvisational jam session. For months, Michael has been in the basement running scales, shadowing, building vocabulary, talking to the wall. He automated those scales.
Right.
And now, on this video call, because the scales are automatic, he can actually listen to the rhythm of the other players and respond in real time. He spends nearly an hour talking about his career, his hobbies, his struggles with the language. The other participants are smiling, asking follow-up questions, and he's answering them spontaneously.
He has successfully crossed the bridge. The knowledge in his prefrontal cortex is finally flowing through his vocal cords into the real world.
And what is his primary realization when the call ends? He realizes that he was communicating. He recognizes that he dropped a few articles. He used the wrong verb tense once or twice, but the ideas transferred from his brain to theirs seamlessly.
And that realization is the ultimate lesson of this entire case study. There is a canyon-sized distinction between communicating perfectly and communicating successfully.
Successfully, yeah.
The biological purpose of language, or really the execution of any complex skill, is the successful transfer of intent and ideas. If the idea lands, the execution is successful, regardless of a mispronounced vowel or a clumsy transition. Fluency, mastery, and confidence are not states of being you magically arrive at one day. They are constructed slowly, one sentence, one awkward conversation, and one mistake at a time.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this deep dive right now? Well, the elegance of Michael's framework is that it scales far beyond the mechanics of learning English. Whether you are attempting to pick up a foreign language, preparing for a high-stakes public speaking engagement, or trying to master a complex new coding language at work, The core cognitive truths remain identical.
They absolutely do.
You have to abandon the illusion that you will eventually feel completely ready. The state of perfect readiness never arrives because it is just a socially acceptable shield used to hide from the vulnerability of execution. Passive studying will only ever yield passive knowledge. You have to intentionally create environments where you are forced to retrieve information under pressure.
Every single time you execute, even if it is messy, even if you are just mumbling to an empty room, even if your brain blanks on the simplest concept, you are thickening those neural pathways.
Mm.
You are proving to your nervous system that it can survive the friction of the attempt. Every awkward, stumbling execution builds a foundation of true confidence that all the passive studying in the world simply cannot manufacture.
You really have to accept the clumsiness of the articulatory loop and step out of the theoretical manual into the practical application.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to mull over as you approach your next learning challenge. If we accept that mastery, fluency, and true confidence are built exclusively through the friction of execution and the data gathered from errors, then perhaps we need to radically redefine our objectives.
I like where this is going. What if the goal for your next spontaneous conversation, your next project meeting, or your next practice session shouldn't be to flawlessly execute and avoid mistakes entirely? What if, instead, your actual deliberate goal should be to bravely and intentionally make at least 3 new mistakes?